In 1939, Der Schulungsbrief, a monthly review of the Nazi Party, published a Greek text, Rede des Pericles, Pericles' Funeral Oration, a speech that was originally delivered in 431 BC by Athens' elected leader in honor of those recently fallen during the first year of the city's war against Sparta. The speech, one of the most celebrated in history, would mark the end of an age, the Golden Age, the most glorious that Athens would ever see, and it's thought to have captured the essence of the most beautiful idea that Athens would produce: democracy. And it was this speech that was being proposed to the members of the Nazi Party as an unvergänglich document, an immortal document of Aryan heritage. But unless there was another Pericles, born in Berlin perhaps, there is no way for the original author of the Funeral Oration to have ever approved of Hitler's Third Reich. And so, as expected, this immortal document was the product of a fraud. But what is truly astounding is that for this fraud to succeed, it only required the most subtle change of only a few words. Most of those who have spoken from this stand gave honors to the lawmaker who added this very speech to the funeral rites for the dead, as they believed it was a worthy thing to speak on behalf of those who die in battle. As for myself, I would find it worthier to honor them through deeds rather than words, like those you see around you, performed through public spending, so that the virtue of the many is not dependent upon the speaking ability of a single orator. The funeral oration was delivered in Athens during a public funeral held in the year 431 BC, in honor of those who had fallen in battle during the first year of the Peloponnesian War, the war between Athens and Sparta that would last for 26 whole years and would end with Athens' defeat and near total destruction. Only a few decades before, the two cities were united against a common enemy, Persia, and together, along with a handful of others, they wrote some of the most finest chapters of military history by defeating the greatest empire of their age. But now, and after becoming small empires in their own right, Athens and Sparta were locked in a fight for survival. Pericles' oration was not saved in its origin, but as part of a famous book by Thucydides, later named The Histories, and considered to be the first work of scientific history. There, the funeral oration works on multiple levels, both as a piece of actual history and as a literary device that introduces the reader to the character of Athens as it stood during its peak and just before its ultimate downfall. This text should have been the least likely candidate for the German propaganda machine to include in their magazines. It's an ode to the democracy that made ancient Athens what it was and what it still is in many ways for us today. Pericles continues, "I will first speak about our ancestors who never stopped living in this country of ours, and thanks to their bravery kept it free, from one generation to the next, until our days, when they passed it on to us, still free, while the task of improving what was received fell on those who are now gathered here, and who equipped this city with all that it was needed, so that she remained independent in both war and peace." Pericles speaks of life in the Polis, the city, the political unit that made up the Greek world during antiquity. The city was not a geographical area or an urban unit, but a country that in most cases was more independent than most nation-states are today. Here, the German document says im staatlichen Leben, life in the state. And the change in meaning is crucial, because one of the most defining aspects of fascism is the absolute devotion to the state, an aspect that is often downplayed in favor of one more obvious, racism. But fascism cannot be explained as a function of mere racism, since, and for all means and purposes, even the founding fathers of America had, by contemporary standards, a clearly racist view on who should be included in the electoral body, with Abraham Lincoln saying publicly that natural differences between the races will forever forbid full equality from being given to all. And yet, what these men created in practice was the best democracy of its time. And if racism is not sufficient to explain the German drive towards fascism, then perhaps the prosecutors during the Nuremberg trials were right all along when they said that Nazi atrocities were the product of that sinister undercurrent in German philosophy which preaches the supreme importance of the state and the complete subordination of the individual. Statism, then, is a German rather than a Greek thing, and a deeply German thing at that. And it's no wonder that with Germany at the head of the EU, our old continent, it's quickly becoming a kind of Soviet superstate. But in contrast to how modern Europeans favor the rule of unelected bureaucrats, in a Greek polis, authority was never delegated and was even rotated among citizens at random. What for Karl Marx, then, was only a fantasy, being a hunter in the morning and an art critic in the evening, as he wrote in one of his letters, for the Athenians of the 5th century BC was a reality, and the average citizen could be expected to serve as a soldier in battle, judge in the high court, and a theater critic during the city's festivals. The differences, therefore, between polis and state are enormous, and the German translators must have known this very well. And I will first expand upon how we reach this point of great power and with what form of government, and then I will praise those dead who lie around us. Because we have a form of government that does not imitate the laws of others, but rather we have become an example that others try to imitate. And that we call it democracy, because governance is in the hands of the many rather than the few. The people of this city-state, Pericles continued, who have just given their lives were not soldiers but erastes, lovers of Athens, who chose to die rather than be deprived of their beloved. Because Athens remains the only city, he tells us, that never copies the ways of others, but creates its own in a way that is unique. And it's at this point that Pericles reminds us of the word Athenians use for this unique process, democracy, where demos means people and kratos, power. But in a tactical evasion, the German translator wrote Volksherrschaft, which is unfortunately, at least technically, correct, as Volk means the people and Herrschaft means rule. Only that Volk was an almost magical word for the Nazis, as it really meant the people as a race, and represented for the German Reich something completely different than demos. To better understand this crucial difference, think once again of America's founding fathers. Their great Declaration of Independence begins by saying, "We the people." What this shows is that a people, a folk, if you will, pre-existed the founding of America, as it pre-exists the founding of any political order, democratic or otherwise. These people that are mentioned in the Declaration, however, were not yet American. They were English, Irish, German, Dutch, and Italian. And it was only when these early settlers came together to form a new state that they became an American people, an American demos, whose sense of belonging stopped being racial but became based on the creation of common laws under which they would live. Laws that ultimately defined a common character and what it means to be an American. So in contrast to how left-wing radicals like Cornel West want to portray it, democracy cannot be racist as it pertains to all people who were present during its founding. We are superior in wartime against our enemies for this reason. We keep our city open and never drive away foreigners from our public spectacles, trying to keep secrets, thinking that if our enemies sees what we are doing, they will gain an advantage over us. And while other cities, and here Pericles means Sparta, are made to train from early age to constant and painful training, seeking to become brave in the process, we live in comfort, yet are no less willing to face the same dangers. Concerning private life, Pericles says that we, Athenians, are liberal and never spy on our neighbors, knowing that whatever power we hold over him stops at the doors of his house. What Pericles makes clear is what most social reformers fail to acknowledge today, that equality is not a matter of private, but of public life. What made Athens unique was not that it leveled the playing field for all members of its society by redistributing their private property perhaps. And women were still deprived of many rights, while slaves of nearly all. No, what made Athens democratic was that among the few that the ancient world as a whole accepted as capable of freedom, there was no preference regarding race, wealth, or family ties, and all were equally likely to hold power. And hold it they did, as even the judges and generals were elected from among the citizens. And so, in a single lifetime, the average Athenian was expected to rule over court cases, lead units in battle, and vote in poetry contests. And it was in this context that Pericles named the rulers as ton ai enarchi ondon, those who alternate in holding power, translated as Obrigkeit in German, meaning the authorities, like for example the police, who during the late 30s could break into anyone's house and drag them to prison with no charges. Yet Athens had no police force whatsoever, as it had no standing army during peacetime, and therefore no official was to coerce its citizens, because the rulers and the ruled were not two, but one entity, the demos of Athens. And so, there are those who suggest that Pericles' speech should be read as a tragedy. And it is true that all the necessary ingredients are there, because the Funeral Oration is a work of political poetry that is fully aware of the finality of human endeavors and almost foreshadows the end of the very city it praises. But if we should read it as such, we must ask, who is the tragic hero of this story? Who is the person who achieved greatness only to cause his own downfall? It's certainly not Pericles, who doesn't even mention his role in the city's ascent, nor the dead, whose value lies not in their individual valor, but the ideals they serve. No, the tragic hero of this story is the city itself, the Polis of Athens, whose downfall is presented in typical Greek fashion, as caused by its own greatness. The story of Athens, and perhaps Western civilization in total, is a story of hubris, a word that so often gets mistranslated as excessive pride. But pride is a Christian sin and a pagan virtue, and for the Greeks, who made the word so central in their tragedies, hubris was not a state of moral decadence, like pride is for the Christian man. No, hubris was committed by heroes, by the best, as a natural consequence of their own greatness that dared to go beyond the limits of faith and challenge the gods.